Okay, so we did rigid bodies last time, which is like you have, hard objects colliding with each other. They're rigid. But let's say you wanted to do like a squishy ball or something. So I just made a sphere, and if you click SoftBody, not much really happens. It just kind of jiggles a little bit. Let me make a plane. And the reason it's jiggling is with the SoftBody simulation, it kind of wants to stay with its origin point. So if I move it around while it's simulating, you get this like jiggle effect. So that can be useful in a number of cases, and I'll go over those in a second. But for the most part, what people really have fun with is detaching it from its origin point. So you can let the ball go and it'll like squish and bounce around on the floor. So what's attaching it to that origin point is this setting right here. It's called the SoftBody goal. I don't know why they call it a goal, but think of it as like SoftBody origin or something. Like how tied to the origin point is it? So if you just uncheck that, all of a sudden it's starting to fall and it's simulating. But why didn't it go through the floor? You can't make this floor a passive, like I don't think if I do a rigid body and make it passive, I don't think they will interact with each other. Yeah, so rigid bodies and making grounds, that's a whole nother like realm. So you need to make this a collision object. So collision objects works for particles, it works for cloth, and it works for soft bodies. I think that's about all, but yeah, and it even says in the collision object, oops, make sure you have the right object checked. So collision, I mean, it even says what types of things you can modify, like how permeable particles or soft body and cloth. But now if we play it, we might get something kind of hideous. But we're getting there. So the first thing was if you wanted to drop, you uncheck the goal. The next thing, the soft body edges. This is where you define like how rigid your structure is. And the three fields that I think are the most powerful are bending and pull and push. And you can think of pulling as like a rubber band. Like what is the resistance if you're trying to pull it apart? Pushing is like a ball, like if you're trying to push it together, like how resistant is it? Now I think those can only be set up to almost 1.99999, and I don't think you'll have much, it'll still kind of collapse in on itself, I think. It does still collapse, but a little slower. So if you add some bending strength to it, it's going to give it, maybe too much rigidity. So this is where simulations is kind of silly. You end up just watching somebody fiddle with like controls. I mean, that's pretty much what simulations is, and that's why it's kind of an art form and kind of like luck too, because you could make something awesome and you open a new project and you'll never get that result again. So you just gotta practice really. So let's set this bending only goes up to like 10. So if you set it to 10, now we're starting to get like a little bounce. But this simulates really slowly, and that's not too nice. And the reason is this sphere is way more detailed than we need it to be to simulate something. So a general rule with simulations is you want to start out with like a lower poly object, just like in the rigid bodies, by default it uses the convex hull. So we're going to do something kind of like that. When you open up sphere, if you have your toolbar open, before you move anything, you can divide the segments and the rings in half. So I'm going to do, instead of 32, 16, and instead of 16 rings, I'll do 8. And now all of a sudden we have like kind of a lower poly sphere, add a soft body. I'm going to turn off the goal. I'm going to add some bending. Let's just do 10. I'm not even going to adjust the push-pull. So really that bending is quite the powerful value. But once you start turning that down, you might have to start turning those up. So all of a sudden this simulates really quickly. But let's say you don't you want something that looks a little smoother. So once you simulate something, in your modifier stack, it shows that you have like a physics simulation going, but you can always, on top of that simulation, add a subdivision surface, which will start smoothing out if you crank up the views and render. Now we have like a really nice looking ball that simulates quickly. It's simulating a low poly object, and then we're just adding a subdivision surface onto it. So this is what it looks like without it and with it. So we don't have to calculate all that extra geometry into the simulation. So that's pretty cool. The next thing, like, let's say you wanted a bunch of balls to hit each other and kind of bounce around. You would notice that they don't seem to interact. Does anybody know why? What would we have to add? What did we add to the floor? We would have to also add a collision modifier to these balls. So this first one, it has a SoftBody physics enabled, but if we enable collision on that one and collision on this one and this one, now they will all like, notice it really slows down once you start, even though they're lower poly objects, when they start interacting with each other, the computer has to think a lot harder. But once it's kind of simulated, you see that you get this dark orange line down there. So now it doesn't have to think anymore. And that's kind of nice. It looks, they jiggle, and then you could you know, add materials, make this one a red, blue, and yellow ball, and that could look pretty nice. If you're super happy with your simulation, this is another, like, all simulations you can bake. And rigid bodies, you bake in this scene tab, like rigid body cache down here, you would hit bake. But for anything else in the simulation world, the option to bake, like with particles too, is within its own settings where you like choose how strong it is. So it's called a cache. And maybe I don't need this to simulate all the way up to 250 frames. Maybe I only need it to right here where it already simulated. So let's just end it at 139. And since I already played this animation, and that's already kind of a dark orange line, I can just say the current cache to bake, and now it's like a hard dark line, and so it's saved. In some cases, you have to save your project before you hit bake. Like it needs, because it's saving like files. It's saving little files to say like at this frame everything looks like this. I don't think I saved this one. I think it's for like smoke simulations or water. So if you ever get to a point where it like won't let you click these, it might just be you have to save your project first. But if you want to change anything, you can free bake, and then maybe like I'll change the parameters on this one or something. Yeah, let's make. We'll just make this push. So we'll make it more, it'll be harder for it to push together. We'll make it like 0.9. And now the cache is clean. And yeah, it resimulates. Or you could just hit this bake button down in the rigid body cache. So right here. And I don't want that to bake all the way, so 140 is good enough. Oop. So you can bake it like that, and then just wait for that to end. So I'm guessing it's slowing down here because the balls are hitting each other, and then once they stop touching each other, it'll speed up. But give that a try. See what you can do with different types of objects. See if you can squish an object through like a tiny hole. I don't know. Oh, and I probably should have hit bake all dynamics, because when I just clicked this one and hit bake, it only baked that one, and then the other ones had to bake. So hitting bake all dynamics if you have a bunch of stuff going on is probably the one you want to push.